Welcome to The Atypical View. I'm your host, Lauren Florio, a licensed marriage and family therapist specializing in autism, ADHD, and broader neurodiversity. As a fellow neurodivergent mind, I'm here to help us learn and spread awareness on all things mental health, as well as help us unlearn harmful stereotypes by providing psychoeducation rooted in research and lived experience rooted in my atypical view. The Atypical View is obviously this podcast, but it's also my private practice where I provide therapy to clients here in California with me and provide neurodiverse coaching to others worldwide. So, without further ado, let's jump into the Atypical View. Let me first say thank you so much for being here for our very first episode. I'm really hoping this is a place where we can connect more deeply with ourselves and the community within mental health and neurodivergence. But let's go ahead and just jump right in. Today's episode is about something very close to my heart and mind, and I believe will be a good way for the listeners to get to know me a little bit better and understand me and my mind a little bit better. Today we're going to talk about AuDHD. AuDHD is the intersection of autism and ADHD. ADHD meaning attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, here's our first little moment of correction. Both in ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it's commonly not really loved by the community in which that is diagnosed to use the word disorder. So in research too, we do see that in quotes, this disorder is really only a disorder or might only be a disorder because of the societal expectations and the way we run the world around us. In a world with different expectations more fitting to these neurotypes, these disorders might actually really thrive. So a common switch out for the D in both ASD and ADHD is difference. Some people prefer to say autism spectrum difference or attention deficit hyperactivity difference. So that's just a quick moment of debunking and de-stereotyping. So whether you're new to the term of AuDHD or already resonate with it, I hope this conversation can bring some clarity and maybe even a little validation. The first segment of today is going to be our psychoeducation portion. We'll jump right in with what is AuDHD. Obviously, I've mentioned these two terms, autism and ADHD. They can come with their own unique sets of traits and challenges and strengths. But for many people, these diagnoses do not show up in isolation. In fact, a growing number of individuals are recognizing themselves in both ADHD and autism. There's some good evidence that shows that having one does make you more likely to have another. Obviously, having both is where the term AuDHD comes from. Let's start with breaking these two apart and better understanding them as individual diagnoses before we explain them combined. So let's start with autism. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition characterized by differences in social communication, sensory processing, and repetitive or very focused, heightened interests. It's not uncommon for autistic people to struggle with social norms, rules, especially the unspoken ones. We see areas of struggle in small talk, and this can be due to having such intense interests. It can be hard to want or care to talk about anything outside of those zones of interest. There are other aspects that contribute to the social difficulties, but I do think that that is a relevant one that's maybe talked about a little less. Like I mentioned earlier, the experience of sensory sensitivity also has some cool research behind it. The research found that autistic individuals may have up to 67% more neurons in their prefrontal cortex compared to neurotypical individuals. This difference is believed to be related to the reduced neural pruning during early development, which basically just means that the brain retains more connections than it typically would in a typical neurotypical brain. So while this may sound exciting, this is what actually contributes to increased sensory input and reduced sensory filtering, making everyday environments feel overwhelming or even painful. This explains why autistic people report heightened sensitivity to light, sounds, textures, social energy. Their brains are literally processing more of everything all at once. This might look like the quiet kind of noises that go in the background, like a fan or a hum from electricity. Your brain just sort of deems it as unnecessary. Or maybe think of a gentle touch of a fabric up against your body. Your brain decides that it's not really relevant and sort of just shifts it out. It doesn't keep it. Whereas autistic people keep it. It can be incredibly uncomfortable to have that additional roughly 40%. Next is that autistic people can really thrive on routines and predictability. Autism is a spectrum, which means it looks different on everyone. And because it looks so different, that's part of why it often goes undiagnosed, especially in women and marginalized groups, which is a much bigger problem that we'll definitely have to talk about on a different day. There is a great quote that if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, because there's so much variability within the spectrum. But when we look at the spectrum, we're also talking about these levels 1, 2, and 3. With level 1, you might not actually even know this person is autistic, and that's due to a couple of things. For starters, if you don't know much about autism and how it shows up through the spectrum, you might not be able to spot it. Part of the reason you might not recognize this person's autistic is, one, they would likely be able to disclose that information on their own, meaning they have higher verbal fluency. One of the reasons you might not be able to spot this is due to masking, which means camouflaging those autistic traits. And there's a number of reasons of why someone masks. It's a bit of an automatic thing, and I think this is a bigger topic that will need to be explored, so we'll cover that in the next episode. For the most part, people automatically mask in order to fit into their social surroundings and not be isolated for their differences. Although there has been a autistic movement lately, if we look through history, a lot of the people who know someone or knew someone with autism maybe 5-10 years ago and even further back in time were likely someone who was more in the level 3 category, meaning they had a caretaker who was disclosing this information for them, for those higher level individuals with autism. And that's because of the level of support that they need. If someone has someone who's supporting them and taking care of them, they're likely disclosing this person's autism on behalf of their child, behalf of their sibling, on behalf of whomever they're taking care of for that person's safety. In a lot of cases, the unfortunate part is that oftentimes people are kinder when they understand what your difference is. I know people get really upset about labels and things like that, but truthfully, those labels have shown that people sometimes treat us better when they understand why we are acting different from them. There is some research that shows this. There was one study where 2 groups of people went in, and one group had a social conversation with some autistic individuals that they didn't know were autistic, and they rated the conversation negatively. And the other group, it was disclosed that the people were autistic, and the people reported better conversations. They were kinder and more understanding. And now I recognize that is not super great in the context of, why can't we just be kind to people without having to know their personal medical information? But I digress. Having those labels do protect us in some way, which is why I was saying the nonverbal or higher level of support need individuals who are in that level 3 zone likely have this information disclosed for them to protect them. And obviously bouncing back between level 1 and level 3, you can imagine that level 2 sort of falls into that middle point. Something that you may have heard before is these levels being spoken about in terms of levels of functioning. So you may have heard the term high functioning or low functioning autism. And I am not really a big fan of that. I think that it represents more of, can this autistic person be sort of this cog in society. It feels capitalistic in the way of, can they meet social expectations and fit in and work a job and pay taxes? And can they not look and act so autistic? And can they do that by harming themselves through masking and camouflaging these autistic traits to basically be quote unquote normal? So cool. All right. You've got a high functioning person. I just think it's ugly language. And so does a large chunk of the autistic community. So while it's not a perfect replacement, I do prefer the terms of support needs. It's not a swap in, swap out exactly. Support needs doesn't automatically mean high support need person correlates with a low functioning person, or a low support needs person correlates with a high functioning person. But I do think it's better verbiage overall for understanding the level in which autism affects people. We do see that there are some studies that show how the dysregulation, the sensory overwhelm, all of that shows up in the brain is actually the same regardless of a level 1, 2, or 3 diagnosis. The differences in where these levels come from is in the individual's ability to, like I said earlier, take care of themselves. How much support do they need? How strongly do these autism criteria, like I mentioned earlier, affect this person's quality of life? How does it affect their ability to communicate? How does it affect their rigidity in the world, their structure, the intensity of their interests? While I think that there is a big misunderstanding throughout the spectrum of autism, and I could definitely spend far more time talking about this, I do think I should move on to ADHD. ADHD involves challenges with executive functioning, meaning attention, memory, focus, organization, time management, task initiation. There's a lot of little bits that can fall into this category. Starting a task, staying in the task, remembering to do the next task. I know it sounds simplistic, but executive functioning is complex. It can also come with impulsivity, or what's considered an inattentive type. You get a lot of these hurtful labels here, like a spaz or a space case and things like that. For how this diagnosis shows up, we see these two, I guess technically three categories within ADHD. There's the hyperactivity type, meaning you're going to see a lot more movement. This person might be more hyperverbal. You might see them bouncing from task to task. There's a lot of energy. They expel a lot of energy. They keep busy throughout the day. It might be really hard to keep them on one topic in a conversation. They might be bouncing around or interrupting. On the other hand, the inattentive type is a little bit more slowed in speech. Like I said earlier, they get that space case label, that zoned out label. Can be pretty hurtful, but we see a little bit more of that daydreamy. They're in their head a little bit more. It can be hard to get them to focus on kind of anything in general. The last one is a combined type where we fluctuate between these two. So with ADHD, it's not uncommon for them to struggle with all of these executive skills, time management, organization, which, if you can imagine, especially with that combined type, going back and forth between high energy, low energy, can be really hard to manage the expectations of the day. So you might see someone struggling with being late to things, tracking their appointments and days and times, maybe jumping between thoughts and tasks. Maybe they start doing their laundry and get distracted and they find something in their closet and pull it out, and then they start organizing some drawer in their closet, but then that makes them remember that they were supposed to do the dishes, and they go, and it's just by the end of the day, like you have 15 unfinished tasks. And it's not uncommon to experience frustration. It can really affect your ability to feel confident, to feel productive, to finish tasks, to feel like you can set out and achieve your goals. So it can really take a toll on your self-esteem. But at the same time, it's not uncommon to feel bored or under or overstimulated, seeking that dopamine, basically. There's also a connection here with being deeply creative and passionate And there's this idea of being hyper focused, meaning suddenly your attention gets really locked in on a specific interest or task. And that can honestly feel really cool. There is this idea that people say that autism is a superpower, ADHD is a superpower. I won't pretend to love that. I think it dismisses the disability part of the disability, but I definitely think that when I get hyper focused, like in the zone, I won't lie, it does feel pretty powerful. So I get it. If that's something that you resonate with, saying that your diagnosis makes you feel like you have a superpower, that's great. It's just not for me. Like autism, ADHD exists on a spectrum and presents differently across genders and age groups, meaning we do see a lot of hyperactivity in young boys stereotypically, where we see a little bit more of that inattentive type in young girls. Understanding AuDHD, which again isn't a formal diagnosis, but is a real lived experience of having both neurotypes, I find that for some individuals who have the hyperactive symptoms of ADHD, it can really cover up some of the symptoms of autism and make it harder to get a diagnosis because of how different these symptoms can present. It can be really challenging to see these different traits separately and give them the proper diagnosis without the proper training. There is this idea that I like to talk about with my clients around, if you've ever seen the movie Inside Out, it's the little Pixar movie with the emotions in the brain. There is this control panel, and typically all of the emotions are fighting for control. In the movie, the little girl who they're in the brain of is called Riley, and all of the emotions are trying to gain control of the control panel to support Riley in some way. Joy is always trying to control it and make sure Riley is happy, but sadness will come up and Riley will cry. And anger will come up and she'll shout. And I like to think of AuDHD around, let's remove the emotions for a moment and put in these little characters of ADHD in the brain by the control panel and a little character of autism in there by the control panel. We'll be a little stereotypical for a moment. You see this autism character, and maybe she just really wants structure and predictability. She might feel a little anxious and really deeply wants to feel safe and sameness. And then ADHD is next to her, and maybe let's say this one is a hyperactive side of ADHD. And maybe she's zooming around and she wants novelty and new and she wants a dopamine hit and she's a little impulsive. So you can imagine that they're fighting for attention in the brain, fighting for dominance. There is this idea in psychology of a primary diagnosis, and it can be challenging with this one of, which one, if either, is the primary. I have heard this expression from other individuals in the community about who's driving the car at the moment. I like this because it's kind of where the control panel comes in of like who's mainly at that control panel. For some people who have both, and maybe the hyperactivity part of the ADHD is at the control panel most of the time, it could really mask and cover up that more intense need for structure, because outwardly, people might see your impulsivity and kind of some of the chaos that you're living in and go, well, that wouldn't add up. So it would definitely affect your ability to get properly diagnosed. Understand that because of the differences in these, it can make it really challenging to get a proper diagnosis, let alone both proper diagnoses. So let's look further of how these two diagnoses show up in the same brain. Some common traits of AuDHD might be feeling this experience of feeling like an ebb and flow of waves of feeling both very rigid and then very scattered, meaning you're craving structure. And I'll note that it's not just an autism benefit to have structure. ADHD brains desperately need the structure. They just really struggle with setting it for themselves. So wanting that structure, yet struggling to keep it, struggling to maintain it. Some more of those contradictory symptoms that we see show up is while someone may have this very intense and specific interest, exploring those interests may also be a struggle because of the executive functioning, the struggle to initiate tasks, the struggle to get their focus on something that they like. There's also the idea of sensory overload on maybe the ASD side, while still having this sensory stimulation, like seeking stimulation, trying to multitask, moving around. Sensory seeking can be a lot of things like touching fabrics, smelling candles, even though on the ASD side, you're overwhelming your system. This is also a really common experience that can lead to burnout. The things that help one part of our neurotype harm another, and it's this constant cycle of trying to take care of yourself and possibly harming yourself in the process, which can obviously lead to burnout. And I don't mean burnout in the sense of like we're overworked and maybe we need a vacation. I mean burnout in the neurodiverse setting, which is a deep and chronic, really hard to get out of fatigue, and it can really look like depression, but it has separate symptoms. We'll have to go into it a little bit more in depth in a different episode because it is very complex. But I think the dynamic between masking and burnout is important in the conversation. It deserves a little bit more time. But struggling with this burnout, it can lead to not being able to follow through on tasks even more so. Can look like laziness, which I'm not a big fan of that word, but truly it is an overwhelm and a shutdown from executive functioning overwhelm, decision fatigue. Your brain literally freezes on the ASD side of things with shutdowns. You can go nonverbal, even if that's not your standard. And on the ADHD side of things, there's this idea of paralysis that happens, and it can really affect your ability to just be. There is an overwhelm and conflicting cognitive needs that people with AuDHD often lead themselves to feeling like they are too much and not enough at the same time. And like I said earlier, it is so common to be misdiagnosed for years. And I want to point out why this education matters. Understanding AuDHD, whether it's your brain and you're finding you're resonating with it in yourself, or you don't know a single person with AuDHD and you're just here. Thank you anyway. It helps us validate ourselves and others and support a group of people who have fallen through the cracks of a traditional diagnosis in the healthcare system, the mental health system, and focusing on these two diagnoses, this AuDHD, it challenges us to think more expansively about the human experience of the brain and build systems that honor how different minds work and break down some of these stereotypes of why we should be a certain way. So this is definitely a good point to transition. We'll go into the atypical view, my lived experience, and I want to connect with you about what it feels like as an individual with both of these diagnoses. So I want to share a little bit of my story, what my lived experience with AuDHD has been, because reading definitions is one thing, but seeing how it shows up in real life is another. I'll start where I started with my understanding of all of this, which I believe was roughly around middle school, although my symptoms were very much so apparent much, much younger. I know I mentioned earlier that inattentive types are more typical with young girls. That was not my experience. I do frequently joke that I wish so desperately that I could simply be mysterious, and that's not in the cards for me. Especially when I was younger, I had the very stereotypical hyperactive ADHD. And to be fair, I still do have a combined type, but inattentive, I think, has grown more as I've gotten older and my hyperactivity has reduced a little bit more. My partner does joke that I kind of get the zoomies, just like our cat and our dog. And sometimes in the evening, they're running around and I'm kind of running around with them. But yes, the hyperactivity has diminished significantly from childhood. My symptoms were really big. I also think that part of the reason the hyperactivity has mellowed out a bit is because a lot of the work that I've done to help with myself as well. You know, part of that work is, which everyone will hate to hear, is in fact meditation. There have been phases in my life where I've truly done this for like hours a day. I don't think that's necessary, and I'm not trying to encourage that you sit and meditate for an hour a day. It was very zen, but I don't got time for that. And honestly, starting with like a few seconds can make a big difference, and trying to strengthen that, moving it up to from 30 seconds to a minute to whatever, just a moment of stillness can make a big difference. And stillness in meditation does not mean a quiet brain. It literally just means sitting with your thoughts without judgment, with curiosity, returning to your breath when you feel distracted. It's not about silencing your mind. There is no such thing. Your brain literally does not stop having thoughts. If it did, we'd be much more concerned because you'd probably be dead. But anyway, there are a lot of other techniques that I use. Obviously, I am a therapist who specializes in ADHD, so there's a lot of tools that I use to support myself in the real world. But I'll be totally frank, inherently, being medicated in adulthood, I wasn't ever medicated as a child. That was a big no growing up. But being medicated in adulthood has helped me do the things that I need to do that gives me just enough motivation to practice things like meditation, to add some structure, to follow through with the organizational tasks that I've put in place to support my ADHD. Anyway, while it was very apparent that I knew from a very young age that I had ADHD, didn't really start getting support from it until maybe a little bit scattered throughout college. And then in the last couple of years, I have really made an effort to take my mental health more seriously. Obviously, in the process of studying psychology, it was part of my education that I did have to go to therapy. So I was taking my mental health a lot more seriously during that phase as well, and still do. Honestly, I probably wouldn't be doing this podcast without my medication. It's a whole lot of consistency. Writing scripts and blogs and having a business it would probably feel much, much harder without medication on my side. Not to say that it would be impossible or that I couldn't do it, but it would be hard. Now, on my ASD side with autism, I think that was a piece that it was kind of like this piece that was missing. Ironically, I know the puzzle piece thing is like a symbol but of autism, but that's a different story for a different time. We're not going to talk about the puzzle piece today, but it did feel like this missing piece that had finally clicked, and it made sense when I got my autism diagnosis. And I resisted that, heavily resisted going through the process of diagnosis because I truly didn't feel like I deserved to take up space in this community. I downplayed my symptoms. I had to pick myself up by the bootstraps and just struggle through with it because that's what society tells me. And it took years of self-acceptance and years of research. So much time, so much time spent researching autism. And then my brain going, oh, that is autism. All of my long history struggling socially, saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, reading the room wrong, has left me with chronic social injuries in romantic relationships, platonic and familial. There has been a struggle. I mean, in work settings, it's all been incredibly difficult. I had definitely resonated with the feeling of I have to fake it till I make it. Along the way, I obviously am very happy with where I'm at being a therapist, and I'll explain why. There are very clear rules of what it means to be a therapist. There are ethical guidelines that I have to follow, and I also apply those ethical guidelines to my coaching as well to help myself feel balanced. So it helps me feel that there is structure to it. It makes it predictable, and surprise, surprise, I need structure, and that works for me. There are modalities that I can follow that are research and I can depend on as part of that structure, and it makes sense. Therapy makes sense. Therapy makes sense in a way that I wish all of my social relationships could, but social relationships are not quite as structured. There has been a lot of improvement with my social relationships throughout my life, and inherently sharing with people who I trust about my diagnosis has helped me significantly as well. Because again, I wish it wasn't true, but in a lot of cases, labels do help people understand you better. And as much as society loves to put us in a little box, sometimes that little box is correct. So it can make a difference. I'm happy to wear the title of autistic. I'm happy to wear the title of ADHD. Masking and burnout was a huge part of how I got diagnosed in the first place and why I dove so deeply into the research. It was like pulling on a never-ending thread of trying to understand myself. I struggled so desperately and got hit with depression diagnosis after depression diagnosis and anxiety and just everything that was not the full picture and not accurate. And yes, I had some symptoms of those things, but it wasn't the primary issue. It was, to me, I felt like my depression and anxiety were a symptom of something else. I wasn't hopeless about life. I was exhausted. I got treated for fatigue. I was just through the ringer in the healthcare system trying to figure out what, honestly, it felt like something was wrong with me. I was trying to figure out what was wrong with me. And things finally clicked after the autism diagnosis. So I look back and sometimes I think that like ADHD has made my life feel very loud and made things feel very big, and autism sometimes makes me feel silent and sometimes invisible. There are a lot of paradoxes in my experience. I deeply, deeply want strong social connections, but I also find it exhausting. I struggle so much with executive functioning. Like I mentioned, the medication helps, but I am so deeply excited about doing new things all the time, and I don't always have the capacity for that. I get a lot of ideas. I feel really driven in moments, but I can't always actualize these things. Can't always fulfill them. That's the executive functioning part. I also just don't have enough time in the day. But there is this weird push and pull of like my brain wants everything organized, and then the second I make a plan, I feel trapped. So it's definitely not easy. For a long time, I thought I was just bad at being a person. I thought I was broken. And it turns out that I was just living in a world that wasn't built for me. I really do believe that. And I believe that having self-acceptance through my personal process, which was years and years and years of researching and trying to feel like I deserve to be in this space. I deserve to be a part of the autistic community. I didn't want to just say, yeah, I'm autistic, but I have been diagnosed. I've done the full assessments. I've done it all. But sometimes I still struggle with that imposter syndrome, and it's not uncommon. I'm not a level 3, and I want to express that. I feel great gratitude for being able to have a voice that I can hopefully spread some awareness and spread some education. And I also feel a deep sadness that there are nonverbal autistics who don't have that same liberty. Having a voice is a privilege, and I just want to acknowledge that. And my experience, while it shares similarities with those who are more affected by the autistic experience, it doesn't eliminate how I'm affected as well. That is important. I don't want to be a part of eliminating those stories. There is a big difference of lived experience throughout the spectrum, and I want to make note of that. I should probably transition into our third and final segment today, which is our call to action. This segment is where I want to encourage you as a listener a call to action. Today, I want to focus on empathy. So if you've resonated with anything in today's session, I just want to say you are not broken. Your brain works differently, and you are still a whole person and worthy of love and acceptance and having a fulfilling life. You do not need to change who you are at your core. I just hope that you show up in the world with kindness and respect, and the rest of who you are is okay with me. I just want you to know that your experiences are valid, and so this week, my call to you, I invite you to do something gentle with your nervous system. This might look like having 30 seconds of meditation. That might look like just taking a pause, taking a deep breath. It might look like setting a boundary or saying no. I love boundaries. I talk about that a lot in therapy. It might look like letting yourself stim, shake, wiggle without shame. It might look like putting in a little research into yourself around ADHD or autism and seeing what reflects your truth. If you don't relate to any of the symptoms that I mentioned today, my call to you would be to just check in with yourself, to show empathy for the people in your life that may exhibit these symptoms, to recognize that while it might be frustrating to experience someone showing up late or struggling to connect socially with you or what have you, understand that the big picture is also much harder to experience. So if you can just have a grain of empathy for someone who is struggling in a way that is different from you, it can make a big difference. Thanks for spending this time with me today. If this episode resonated with you, feel free to share it, subscribe, leave a comment or a review, or send it to someone who might benefit from the psychoeducation, or just need a little reminder that they are not alone. If you are interested in my coaching or therapy services, you can reach out to me directly and connect with me at theatypicalview.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and I hope we can stay connected.